Enquirer, and how it came together.
Mm-hmm.
Did you want to say just a few more words about the impact of having that vehicle?
Oh, yeah.
To get the word out about the strategy campaign.
Oh, absolutely. It was an interesting kind of thing. Once it was established with funding, the editor was Carl Holman, who was an English professor at Clark College at the time. Well, I was then living out in Los Angeles, and so I became the West Coast editor for the Atlanta Enquirer. And so during the 1960 election, in which John Kennedy was elected, I received, which I've always donated to the Robert Woodruff Library, a telegram from Carl Holman saying, we need an immediate analysis of how black people, Negroes at the time, are going to vote during this election. Well, I set about doing a kind of polling and all of that, and found that the decisive move that was made was that call that Kennedy made to Coretta King when Dr. King had been arrested and sent to Reedsville. Well, I wrote the article and sent it back to Carl. And the interesting thing is the paper actually won an American Political Science Award for national reporting, that little paper that grew out of the Atlanta student movement. I mean, it had a great impact. It really did. You know, basically you had mainly students kind of working in the paper with Carl Holman as the editor. But it just shows really the strength of students, basically. And frankly, when you really look at revolutions that occur around the world, it's usually the people who are unencumbered. And who are they other than the students? They don't have mortgages and car notes. Nowadays, though, they have student loan debts, which may temper some of their and
Okay, movement lawyers, Donald Hollowell, Howard Moore. We interviewed Judge Horace Ward last week.
Mm-hmm.
Alexander. Let's talk about the movement lawyers and their impact on them.
Sure. Well, Donald Hollowell was, man, what a giant. Basically, he was one of those people who basically would, his practice provided a kind of umbrella under which many of the top lawyers in this city really worked. Of course, there was A.T. Walden, who was another outstanding lawyer here, whom many of the whites refer to as Colonel Walden. I don't know where they start calling lawyers colonel, but I think it all grew out of the Civil War. And after the war, anybody who fought, they would just call colonel. So they called him Colonel Walden. But Hollowell, basically, on March 15th, he was right there with his staff, ready to bail out anyone, but also through the Atlanta Life Insurance Company, which absolutely must be a marker at their old site. Through Atlanta Life, basically, they had arranged for bail. Many people, they were going to use many of the mortgages that they held for bail to get the students out. I mean, that shows just how important it is to have black businesses who are right there, many of which are, you know, no longer around now, you know. But Hollowell was the person who was poised to really spring everyone out who had been busted. I had a personal experience because when I had moved to Los Angeles, I was working as a psychiatric social worker at the Veterans Administration out in Brentwood. And at the time, we had the conscription. Basically, I'd received my draft notice. Well, basically, at the time, we had concluded that many of the jurisdictions where students had been arrested, they did not wish to challenge many of those cases. And so what they did was they reached out to draft them into the military. Well, because I had led the group and I was the only person who was identified at Sprayberry's cafeteria at the Peachtree 7th building, essentially what happened was they issued a wanted for me, and so I was essentially indicted later, and so I simply went down to the DA, and you know, that was pretty much the procedure. But we were thoroughly convinced that none of the jurisdictions absolutely wanted to challenge their segregation laws legally. So a formula would be to simply draft us into the military. So while out in California, working at the VA, I'd gotten in touch with Mr. Hollowell, and we held, I knew somebody at a military base out there, so he let me use a long-distance line on a military base, and we had this discussion about how we were going to fight this, because my position was that I ain't going to nobody's war. Can't fight for a segregated society. So Hollowell's position was that he was thoroughly convinced that because the Selective Service was located in the Peachtree 7th building, that probably was a strategy that was being employed. So what we were able to do was delay and delay and delay, and got temporary deferments. And then interesting thing began happening. Many of the students who had been arrested in sit-ins began volunteering for the Peace Corps. So some of those politicians started saying, well, you know, if they can go to the Peace Corps, they can go to the Army. So right away, they really, with vigor, went after students who'd been arrested. I wonder if I could be excused for a minute.